There is no free will, full stop. There's not even a little bit. But notice, how did you respond to me saying that? Be fully honest with yourself. What was your internal reaction when I said there's no free will? Did you notice a tensing up inside? Was there an aversion to be open to the idea that there is no free will? Because there are many debates for and against free will, but what I don't see often enough is people addressing the confirmation bias to have free will and maybe to not have it, although I don't see how there could be a bias for the rejection of free will because it's literally an absence of something that the separate self has. I don't know why the separate self would want there to be no free will, but nevertheless, people don't address their own confirmation biases so often. And before you can arrive at any sort of truth, you have to have this conversation with yourself about what you really care about. Do you care about the truth, or do you care about preserving your idea of yourself and your sense of control because you feel empowered with it? I would suggest it is the egoic mind, the sense of being separate, that wants to cling on to this notion of free will, because the ego thinks it has control, and so it wants to maintain the control that it thinks it has. And so there's typically an outright refusal to entertain the notion that there is no free will. What I mean by free will is the ability to make a decision which is not a direct result of preliminary factors which were beyond your control. So whatever action you exert, that's intimately tied into this net of universal causality and conditioning. And there's no way to extricate yourself from that, to make a decision that is not the result of some preliminary factor which resides within the universe. And what I see a lot of is, rather than people focusing on the truth that there's no free will, I'll get into the arguments in a minute, rather than focusing on that, they'll jump to the implications of no free will that they're assuming to be the case, and they'll use these hypotheticals as reasons to justify not acknowledging that there is no free will. So, for example, I say there's no free will, and the immediate response could be, oh, so criminals should just walk free then, since they're not responsible. Well, no. There's no free will, but that doesn't mean that it's still not practical for society to have repercussions in place for particular actions, such as stealing or murdering, things of the sort. So we can acknowledge that there is no free will, and at the same time, maintain these useful fictions of assuming responsibility and having punishments for particular crimes. And if we don't do that, society collapses. And obviously, as humans, we have the bias for that to not happen. So it's just this very common response that I see of people jumping to weaponize their assumed implications of no free will in order to justify not accepting that it's the case. And that's simply up for each individual to wrestle with for themselves. Personally, I think it's quite liberating to acknowledge that there is no free will. It's a huge relief. And as well, it makes me have compassion for other people in a whole new light. Because I can no longer perceive anyone as being purely evil, no matter what they do. When someone does something horrible, it's just obviously a result of the preliminary factors that they were met with in their life. And at no point along the way can I believe that they chose to just be an evil person with free will. They were simply met with certain conditions in life which were beyond their control, beyond their choice. And so I have a deep sense of compassion for everyone because of this. I see everyone as ultimately innocent and maybe just ignorant. That's why people do despicable things. It's ignorance, it's not evil. So this is how I wrestle with the absence of free will. It's quite liberating. And it makes me be much more accepting of other people's decisions, to see how their past conditioning is what molded them to be the particular type of person that they're presenting as. So why isn't there free will? For quite a few reasons. The primary one is that there isn't ultimately a separate self to begin with. So there is no one to have free will if there's no separate entity that exists. And maybe that's a different video topic to have altogether, no self. But let's not get bogged down in the details on that one. I'll just move to the next reason. As I alluded to before, you don't choose the preliminary factors that mold you into the type of person that you are. And at surface level, choices can seem to be made, sure, but they're not freely chosen. They're the responses that you've been conditioned to give. And one might think, well, this is quite disempowering. Only if you're self-obsessive, only if you're clinging to being in control, and that's just the ego. So there's a certain level of surrender that needs to take place to fully come to terms with this. Why do you need to be in control? And who's the one that wants to be in control? And you also don't have free will because you just simply can't choose what occurs to you. So for your will to be truly free of constraints, you would have to be able to will what you will. But if it doesn't occur to you to will a particular thing, then you can't freely choose to will that thing. You don't really choose your thoughts, even. How it really happens is a thought just appears without anyone's consent, and then after the fact, the mind may appropriate that appearance of the thought with a story that says, I chose to think this, and then it just believes its own story, and it runs with that false presupposition. But when you really fully pay attention to the nature of thoughts and how they arise, and you're completely honest with yourself about it, it's just obvious that no one chooses their thoughts. And so if you don't choose your thoughts, you can't choose your volition. You can seem to choose to follow a thought, but whichever thought you follow and affirm, that's also based on your past conditioning and what you're prone to, what your proclivities are as an individual. And the ironic thing is that acknowledging that there's no free will, it doesn't actually change very much about your own actions in life. You're still going to live as if you have free will, but how it does affect you is it changes your perception of other people's actions. So you might not take other people's actions quite so personally. If there's free will, then everything is a personal matter. And in taking things personally, you sort of cling on to particular events. When you personalize them, you keep them around for longer than they would need to be. And that's where rumination happens, and you just get in your own way. Whereas if you can fully acknowledge that no one has free will, everything is ultimately a reaction to a reaction to a reaction to a reaction ad infinitum, then that takes the personhood out of it. And for the ego, that's terrible news. But if you're not clinging to your idea of yourself and your sense of control, it's very liberating. It's a huge relief to just surrender it, to let it all go. And I'm using the word surrender in a loose sense here, because it's not as if you have free will in the first place that you could actually surrender. What's being surrendered is the conviction that you have free will. It's giving up that need to be in control. It's very liberating to let go of that.